For our thoughts this morning, I think it's important that I encourage all of us to read. You know, we're an educational institution, are we not? And we can't teach what we don't know any more than we can come back from where we've never been. And most of us have to get our information from what we read. We don't have enough friends or acquaintances to learn everything by conversing with them, and we don't live long enough to have enough experience to learn things. So it behooves us to learn things out of books, doesn't it? To learn to read. Some time ago, several years now, I was preaching a gospel meeting at a congregation that many of you would be familiar with in a distant city. Pretty good sized church, 250 or so. And along about midway during that meeting, the elders of the church took me aside and they said, "Paul, can you help us?" Said, "We love our preacher. We love his family and his children. They're good people." They'd been working with that church for about 2 years, but the elders quietly told me, "Our congregation is starving in the pulpit. The lessons simply were not feeding." I suggested to the elders, I was pretty young at the time myself, but I suggested, well, I don't know exactly what you're going to do, but I said, I have sat with him this week several hours in his study, and I've been amazed that there are no books on his shelves. There were a few commentaries, Gospel Advocate commentaries, good books, and there were some stacks of old Gospel Advocates with good material in it, of course. But so far as reading widely, he did not do that. They said, "Well, what can we do about it?" I said, "Well, I think I would buy him some books." And I suggested that you give them to him. Don't put them in a church library, but give him the books. And with the expectation that he read those books. They bought him about 17 or 18 books that I suggested had been useful to me. And after about another year and a half, they let him go because he simply did not read. And a preacher who does not read cannot feed. But that's true of each of us. And as Christians, we should be in the self-help business so we can be ministers or helpful to others. In my preaching classes and speech classes, you sometimes will have people that will get a Reader's Digest article or something like that and come to a class and regurgitate it for a speech. Sometimes they would make up things as they went, had more of a gift of gab than they did of thought. And I would suggest to them that you need content. You can only be a delivery boy if you got something to deliver. I used to deliver newspapers. Now, I was not one who could gather the news, nor was I one who could write the articles for the newspaper, but I was a fantastic delivery boy. And I suggested to my students that you can be a delivery boy a long time before you can be an editor. And I think as preachers and teachers we can be that, but we have to be able to select what we're going to share and deliver. If you came and knocked on the door and said, "I'm here," somebody said, "Well, what are you here for?" "Oh, I'm your delivery boy." "Well, what did you bring?" "Nothing." It does not work. I'm not creative enough to build all my own suggestions or thoughts or sermons. I must depend heavily upon others. So, Scripture says a lot to us about this. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 12, verses 11 and 12, "The words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails given by one shepherd. Be warned, my sons, of anything in addition to them. Of the making of books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh." Now, nearly all of our students know that verse, that reading is tiresome. Solomon is not saying don't read. He's saying be careful what you read. There's a lot of stuff written that's not worth reading. We have to have some standard by which we determine what is worthwhile or what is true. And we test these things by our own experience and by the reading widely. And we can ascertain who has something worthwhile and who does not. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, writing to Timothy, his young protege in the faith, says in chapter 2 and verse 15, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." In the 4th chapter of that book, just before his execution, while in prison, he writes, "Do your best to come to me quickly." He's wanting Timothy to come to him. "For Demas, because he loved this world, has departed from me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he's helpful to me in my ministry. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and my scrolls, especially the parchments." The Apostle Paul wanted his books. He wanted, even though he was very old, didn't have much to look forward to in terms of service, but he wanted to read. Out at the crossing, we have some people in their 90s. A few days ago, Elena ate lunch with a lady who's 97 years old. And she laid a book up on the table that she'd been reading. It's a book by Jerry Clower from Mississippi. And she was saying that when she started the book, she had to finish it. There was something about it that had to finish it. Jerry Clower was a feed salesman, a humorist, an after-dinner speaker all over the United States. Why would a 97-year-old woman be reading that book? Well, there were funny stories in that book. There were things that she could identify with. There were things that kept her thinking. I've observed that people who read keep their faculties longer. I don't know if you can remember a time in our history when men who were educated were thought to be dangerous, in the pulpit especially. And it was so that in some religions, if you were educated, you were not thought very highly of. And during that time, one of these old preachers was preaching in a tent meeting, and he says, "I'm ignorant. I ain't never been to school a day in my life. I thank God for my ignorance. I pray God will make me ignoranter." And one of the guys stood up in the back, about 3 sheets in the wind, and he said, "Boy, God got a job on his hand to make him ignoranter." I think that it behooves us to be raising the standards of our preachers and ourselves as teachers, and as Christians be known as people who are informed. Of course, that includes Bible reading, Bible study. Brother Weaver, Faulkner University years ago used to say in the library, reading maketh a fool man, writing maketh an exact man. Someone else has said, those who do not read have no advantage over a person who cannot read. That's something to think about. You and I are, at this point, the sum total of all of our thoughts up to this time. And as I said earlier, I'm not original enough in my thoughts to be very much of a man if that's all I'm dependent on. I feed off of the others. A few years ago at Faulkner, they were having a raising the standards in preachers and church leaders retreat. We invited people to come, and that was the point of the thing. Dr. May and I had assignments. His assignment was to speak on helpful books for preachers. My assignment was independent study. I talked him into swapping with me because he knew a great deal more about independent study than I did. Of course, he knew more about helpful books that preachers needed than I did too, but he agreed to swap with me. The things that I worked on, I fully understood were just opinions, things that had been helpful to me. But it was my purpose to stimulate the thought that I want to do today for us. We make various excuses for not reading. Mainly, we say we don't have time. People who read make time for reading. I remember your grandpa, Michael, had books by his chairs. He had books everywhere. He was forever reading. And so he had information, knowledge. We need to learn to read widely. Raising the standard in preachers and church leaders, it seems, would demand that we read. Because readers are leaders, and leaders are readers. Raising the standard would demand that we read widely, broadly, in many fields. Because our responsibility to help people to live life fully in accordance with the will of God demands that we know Scripture and that we know something about people, about human nature, and how we function. We need to know about economics. We need to know about psychology. We need to know about health. What field do we not need knowledge in, at least enough to be conversant? If we're going to raise the standard in preachers and church leaders, it would demand that we read the Bible with better understanding, better comprehension. Dr. W.B. West, who's taught in many of our Christian schools, deceased now, of course, the late Dr. West, said, one who reads the Bible only will not understand the Bible. And how true that is. One who reads the Bible only will not understand the Bible. And so I thought about this topic that was assigned. And personally, I was just learning to read. Elaine hates for me to tell the story, but I couldn't read till I got out of college and took a reading course so I could read fast enough to comprehend what I was reading. But once I learned to read, I read my library, and it's a great library, and I read good books. And when I began to understand what was in books, I enjoyed study. I enjoyed making preparation to teach. And I spent a lot of time with self-help books. A lot of fun is made of self-help books. But if you grew up in Walker County where I did, you needed a lot of help. And not everybody was willing to help you, so you depended a lot on self-help. And so any books that taught me how to help myself were important. Now, I spent hundreds of dollars on self-help books. And Elaine finally said to me one day, said, you remind me of somebody that studies architecture and he decides on the kind of building he wants and everything, gets everything down perfectly, goes out and buys all the bricks and the mortar and the sand, everything he needs to build. And she says, now when are you going to start building? Because I was planning for a great life. She wanted to know when I was going to start building. Well, we know that building involves practice what you learn. But it's important first that you get the information. Self-help books. Make fun of them if you want to, but every book is a self-help book. I suggested in my talk that all preachers and teachers, Christian leaders, need a really good study Bible with limited helps in the Bible to help you find what you're reading and what you want to, other places you want to find. Every library ought to have good commentaries, as many as possible, and should have books on Christian theology and on hermeneutics, how to read the Bible, and books on history, Bible history, church history, geography. Need all those books, reference books that help us for specific situations. And everybody needs books on personal growth. Books that help us with human understanding, human relations. And we all need books with certain topical studies. We don't have to own these books. We can borrow them from a library. We can pick them up when we have a special interest in those things. A good conversation for preachers and church leaders to have when we're together is, what good books are you reading lately? I was in the office of a fellow preacher one day, and I was holding a meeting at his congregation, a pretty large congregation in another state. And I said, what good books have you read lately that you can share with me? Because that's how I knew what to read. I didn't read fast enough to figure out the book wasn't worth reading after I got started. I needed to know if it was a good book before I started it. Here's exactly what he said to me. He said, I hadn't read a book in over 6 months. He said, I don't have time to read. He said, by the time I get through with Sports Illustrated every week and the newspaper every day, he said, I don't have time to read. I have to prepare my sermons and do my visiting and all. I just hadn't had time to read. Well, that preacher preached for some pretty good congregations because he borrowed heavily from other people on their finished products, their sermon outlines. And he did a pretty good job of delivery of their material. But he didn't last long in any church. About 2 years, and that was it. Because ultimately, if a congregation's not fed and there's hunger, there's restlessness. So, what do we do about reading? How do we determine what we ought to read? Well, topically sometimes we read about something that is troubling us or troubling a situation that we're in. And that would cause you to read widely about marriage and divorce and remarriage, if that's the topic that's a problem. I think debates are good. Anything on church management, leadership, those things. When the problem is before us is a good time for the study, special study. There are several books in our brotherhood on questions and answers. Dr. May has one. Shepherd has one, Questions and Answers, and others. Some of those books are good. The point is, we must read. We must take time to read. My topic assigned, though, was non-biblical books that every preacher should read. Well, now, who was I to decide what every preacher should read? But I did suggest some that were helpful to me. Let me mention some quickly. They're just strictly my personal opinions, and I don't claim any particular balance. But two books that were especially helpful to me were books written by women psychiatrists on the subject of misogyny. When I first read the book, I read the book because of a problem that existed that I was being asked to help a person with. And being naturally bright like I am, when I don't know anything about something, I'll try to read up on it. And I was directed to two books. Misogyny, I didn't even know what it was, is a study of men who hate women. And there were two books that I purchased that were helpful by these two psychiatrists. One was Dr. Susan Forward. She wrote a book, Men Who Hate Women and Women Who Love Them. And the other was by Dr. Margaret Rennick. And the name of that book was Christian Men Who Hate Women. That was such an intriguing study of something that I never had been aware of. But I think every preacher, elder in a church, people who are interested in helping people need to understand this particular sickness that plagues so much of the church. Another book that really was helpful to me was a book called Men and Marriage. It was a revised and expanded edition of a book was entitled Sexual Suicide. This book was written by a man who was not a preacher, but he was an economist, George Gilder. And he wrote this book about the most profound crisis in our society in America today. Involves the home and the imperiled family. The internal turmoil caused by the sexual revolution that we're facing today. Competition between men and women and the breakdown of well-defined roles have ravaged the traditional family, destroying the harmony in our society. Men in Marriage outline the steps to revitalize the family and to solve many problems caused by its deterioration. The book's greatest value to me is Gilder's ability to circumscribe the problems and to clarify the causes, even from a secular and a social point of view. Gilder is an economist, not a preacher, not a sociologist. He was a speechwriter for President Reagan. He was the writer of several books on economic issues. Some of the other books were Wealth and Poverty, The Spirit of the Enterprise, Visible Man, Naked Nomads, The Party That Lost Its Head. So the book on Men in Marriage sounds out of character for him. But he did one of the greatest jobs I've ever seen of dealing with the problems we have in America today. Now, he wrote this book 40 years ago now. I'm sure he's dead. Men in Marriage ought to be read by everybody, in my opinion. There are many other books. I have a bunch of them listed. I'll not talk about all of them. But one of my favorite books of all time is the book, The University of Hard Knocks. If you've not read this book, or if you don't own this book, you ought to have it, I think. That's my opinion. Because this book is so practical, down to earth, funny, useful. It was written in 1913. The issue I read was first was dated 1914. I started reading it late one night while Elaine was sewing to a little dress for our first child before her birth. And I started reading the book, read a couple of chapters, and enjoyed it so much. I went and told her, I said, "You got to read this book." But she was sewing. I started the third chapter, and I said, "No, I'm going to read it to you." And I started back to verse and read the whole book that night to her. It was so funny, but so useful. I've thought about this many times. There is no excuse for ignorance in our day if we can read. No excuse. The most important book we can read is the Bible. And we ought to spend more time there than anywhere else. But to make our Bible reading most useful, we need to read widely. This is a spiritual matter. Read. Read. Read.